Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to get started about 5 minutes after, allow people to get on and see there's several people there already. I just want to make sure everybody can hear me. We will be taking questions toward the end of the webinar. I want to make sure that everybody that has questions sends them. Certainly, we've got a PowerPoint we're going to go through, but this is about talking fishing, getting to your questions about a technique that I use year-round to catch quite a few fish. I've caught several fish over 10 pounds, definitely 9 and 10 pounders using this technique. And so I want to make sure that you all have your questions answered. So feel free to fire away. And toward the end of the webinar, I'll just go through and answer as many questions as I can. Again, welcome. This is Ricky Shabazz. We're going to be talking about the Neko rig this evening, and we're going to get started about 5 minutes after, allow folks to get off of work, depending on where you all are. I'm coming to you from the West Coast. It's a little after 6:30 here. For those of you in the Midwest and on the East Coast and parts there around the country or around the world, please. Thanks. Yeah, you don't see me yet. You should see a PowerPoint. I shared the screen, so you should see a PowerPoint. Yeah, I just stopped sharing the PowerPoint. You setting up a couple other screens, so bear with me. And the PowerPoint should be back up. Also want to thank those of you who are sharing, coming in to hear the PowerPoint from during a week where the Bassmasters Classic is going on. Man, I didn't know I was going to be set this webinar up during the Bassmasters Classic, but we will get through it. Here we go. One more minute, we'll get started. Thank you all again for coming to hear about the Neko rig. We'll get started about 5 minutes after. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started again. I want to be respectful of folks' time. I want to thank you all for joining in to talk about fishing, and we're going to be talking about the Neko rig today. A little bit about me. My name is Ricky Shabazz. I am a outdoor writer, marine specialist for Navionics. I do seminars all over the country, do 3 or 4 of these webinars a year for Navionics. This is about helping you catch more fish. You can see my Facebook page there and my website. I'm located in Southern California. I'm a tournament angler and outdoor writer. My home lake is Diamond Valley, where typically I win with my team partner. We win 3 or 4 tournaments a year on this Neko rig. It works throughout the country, works in rocky lakes, grass, vegetation, wood, but we'll get into that. My favorite lake is California Delta and/or Clear Lake, those places up in Northern California. I fished FLW Costa, Wild West Bass, One Bass, several other team circuits. Writer for Western Bass, One Bass, Bass West, do seminar speaking all over the country. Again, marine specialist for Navionics. I do have a day job. I'm a vice president of a community college, and you see some of my sponsors. But again, if you want to get a hold of me, if you have questions after the webinar, you can email me at rshabazz@navionics.com or visit my website or connect with me via Facebook. So again, thank you for taking time to join the webinar. I'm going to speak for about 20 or 30 minutes of the presentation and then do another 20 or 30 minutes worth of questions. The webinar is being recorded, will be available on navionics.com in a couple of days. Everyone is muted. You should see a prompt on your screen to ask questions. I'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but you can start asking questions as we go through the PowerPoint. I'm going to go over the Neko rig, what it is. I'm going to talk about the baits that I use, how I rig the baits. I'm going to talk about the rods, reels, and lines. I'm going to talk about the techniques, and I'm going to show you some locations and how we use these Navionics charts to find locations, high percentage spots in a lake to catch bass off the Neko rig. If you have any questions, just click on the chat at the bottom of the screen at any time during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I'll review the questions and answer as many as possible. If you run out of time, you can always email me at rshabazz@navionics.com. I kind of speak fast, so bear with me, but I am going to get to everyone's questions. So let's talk about the Neko rig. I was real fortunate about 15 years ago that I fished with an angler by the name, or Japanese angler at that, by the name of Hideki. Hideki is the person who brought this technique from Japan to the U.S. Hideki fishes a co-angler. He used to be the lure designer for Reaction Innovations in several other countries. He designed lures such as the Vixen and a bunch of other baits for Reaction Innovations. He now works with Bub Tosh. Hideki, again, is a Japanese angler who does a lot of fishing on the West Coast and throughout the country. He's fished FLW. So I drew Hideki, and he showed me this technique, which consists of a nail-weighted bait. In this case, you see a Vol screw-in weight. It's kind of evolved, but we started out with just regular nail weights. I'm going to show you a picture of that. It has a lot of names: the Neko rig, the Dick rig. Most of my friends, we just call it the rig. But it's essentially a nail-weighted bait. It's a little different than using a shaky head, in that you insert some kind of weight in the head of a plastic worm or a creature bait. I'm going to show you some examples of baits that I use. It's wacky rigged. In this case, you see shrink wrap and a hook. Typically, I use a Gamakatsu 1/0, depending on the size of the bait. It catches fish, and typically it's going to outfish a drop shot. It's definitely a bait that you use similar to a Senko. It allows the baits that are not a Senko to kind of glide like a Senko. It doesn't really shimmer like a Senko. It'll glide. And I believe that a Neko rig, or the rig, will outfish a drop shot all day, every day in 0 to 25, mainly because a lot of people are drop shotting or throwing a shaky head, and the fish have not seen this bait, a lot of your baits, a lot of your bites are going to come on the fall. This is an excellent bait to fish on points, to fish on bluffs, to fish around docks. This bait, the Neko rig or the rig, will get bites in a lot of different places. Again, here what you see is a Zoom trick worm, green pumpkin. I tend to stick to natural colors, green pumpkin, watermelon candy. You see the shrink tube, which you can get from any hardware store. The purpose of the shrink tube is when we first started doing this, we wouldn't use the shrink tube, and sometimes you would lose fish because the plastic or the hook would rotate back into the plastic. Using shrink tube decreases the chances of that. It also increases your hookups. You see a 3/16 ball screw-in weight, and again, a one-eye Gamakatsu drop shot hook. So you pretty much insert a weight in the head of whatever favorite plastic worm, creature bait, stick bait that you like. These are some of the baits that I use, missile-based fuels, which will be on the next screen, brush hogs, robo worms, slim sinkos, minnow baits, jackal, flick shade. And these are the colors that I use, which are a combination of natural colors, shad pattern colors. This bait can emulate a lot of different things. And when you put the weight in the head of the bait, it allows the bait to glide through the water column, and a lot of your bites will come as the bait is sinking to the bottom. Here's some other baits that we use. Again, a one-eye drop shot, a Yamamoto Cinco. There you see the missile-based fuse, which is kind of a crawl worm, a Zoom finesse worm. In addition to using a shrink tube, we also can use an O-ring. So on a fatter worm, and you can use an O-ring in place of shrink tube. And again, the purpose of an O-ring or a shrink tube is to keep your hook from rotating back into your plastic, and it holds the hook in place in a way that it just doesn't if you don't use an O-ring or shrink tube. So let's talk about baits and rigging. 90% of the time, or 99% of the time, I'm using a 3/32 lunker lure, lunker city nail insert weight. And depending on the size of the bait, I'll either use half of that nail, or if I'm fishing in deeper water, I'll use the entire nail. So sometimes I'll just bite off a piece or use my pliers to cut off a piece. Typically, I'm fishing this bait on 6-pound fluorocarbon line with a 20-pound braid leader, using a uni to uni knot. Uni to uni knot, there's a lot of different knots to attach braid to fluorocarbon. I by and large use Daiwa braid, and I either use Toray fluorocarbon. There's a lot of good fluorocarbons on the market. Again, this is not about selling product. You can take these concepts and apply to whatever baits or line that you like to use. This is just what I use. You can also use an improved clinch knot on the hook. 1 second. Jesse, or excuse me, Joseph, in terms of what time of year, this bait works year round, but it's definitely deadly in the spring and in the fall. But this technique works year round. Times that I use straight fluoro is if I'm skipping docks or if I'm fishing around wood. I found that the braid to fluoro when I'm fishing around docks or wood doesn't allow me to skip the bait underneath objects. And sometimes the wind will get a hold of your braid and mess up a flip or a skip underneath a dock. So if I'm fishing around wood or if I'm fishing around docks, I won't use fluoro to braid. I'll use straight fluorocarbon just because I feel like I skip the bait a lot better when I don't have that knot. And if it's windy, I found that the wind will catch your braid and it'll mess up your skips. This technique is totally different than a drop shot. In the lakes that I fish in Southern California, highly pressured, or throughout the West, highly pressured fish, they get conditioned to a drop shot. And this technique absolutely will outfish a drop shot 0 to 25. Deeper than 25 is hard to maintain bottom contact with this bait because you're not using that heavy of a weight. And when you use a heavy of a weight, it messes up the glide and the presentation. So again, we talked about using the shrink tubing and O-ring. This is a better picture of a couple of different baits. You have a Yamamoto cuttail worm, you have a Zoom trick worm, you have a Yamamoto Cinco, and you see both there, the shrink wrap and an O-ring. And again, the shrink wrap, you just go to the electrical section in your hardware store and get the appropriate size shrink tube. I don't heat up the shrink tube. I get the shrink tube where when I apply it to the worm, it pretty much holds your hook in place. And that's a good example right there of the hook being held in place so that the plastic doesn't rotate back over the hook. If I want to make, well, so typically what I'll do is pre-rig 30 to 40 baits with nails in them, because you will lose baits, but they're not that expensive. And I'll just get another bait out of whatever bag or bait that I'm using. So typically I'll pre-rig 30 to 40 baits at a time. Sometimes I'll pre-rig 100 baits. In order to make this bait weedless, which you can make it weedless, you don't see it weedless here in this picture, but in order to make it weedless, what you could do is just expose the hook so that you barely have the point of the hook sticking out. And so you can create a groove in whatever plastic you're using so that the hook point is actually in the plastic. And then when you get a bite, just the sheer force of setting the hook will cause the hook point to come out. And typically, because these are smaller baits, finesse baits that you're using, the fish is pretty much going to swallow the bait, so you don't really have to worry about that. I do use fish attractant. I believe in it. I think it takes the smell of your hands off. And so typically I'm going to use some kind of Bang or Smelly Jelly, or I'll put Bang and Smelly Jelly in the packs of whatever baits that I'm using. I use spinning equipment to fish this technique. What you see here is a flick shake with a nail rig, or the rig. I use a Daiwa Steez SVF spinning rod, 7-foot medium light. So you want to use, if I'm using 6-pound test, 8-pound test, 10-pound test, I'm going to make sure that I use a rod that has backbone, but it really has a light tip. You're going to want as fast of a spinning rod, or excuse me, spinning reel as possible. I use a Daiwa Ballistic. Again, there's a lot of good equipment out there. This is not about selling equipment. This is just what I use. You want to use a very sensitive spinning rod, typically around 7 feet, that has backbone, and a quick, the fastest spinning reel as possible, because a lot of the fish will bite this bait on the fall, or if they don't bite it on the fall, they'll pick it up and just run with it. And you'll need to be able to pick up your line real quick. Again, I primarily use 6-pound tests for deep clear water or highly pressured fish. And if I'm at places like the California Delta or Clear Lake, I typically will go 8 to 10 pounds. So I'll use as heavy a line as I think I can get away with. I'll never use heavier than 10 pound. I just found that using 12-pound tests doesn't allow the bait to glide through the water column like using 8 or 10 or 6-pound tests. And again, I get a lot of bites on the fall on this bait because it glides with that nail in the head. And it does catch big fish. I'm going to show you the largest bass I've caught on it was in a tournament, just under 10 pounds in FLW tournament. So let's talk about locations. Typically, I'm looking for humps, channel swings, bluffs, points. And so this is where using good mapping, this is where using good electronics will allow you to find high percentage spots. So in this case, this is a channel swing going into a hump. This would be a place that I would actually use this bait. In fact, this exact spot I won a tournament off of, my team partner and I. This is Lake Castaic in LA County, and we used the nail rig on this spot to win a team tournament where we caught about a 6-pound bass, the largest of the tournament, off this spot using a nail rig. But this is an example of a high percentage spot, which is a channel swing. And what you see, when I'm talking about a channel swing, is where the channel runs into a point or the shore. Basically, you see that swing there. And the way these contours work, the further the contours are apart, the less steep the break is. The closer the contour lines are together, that typically means vertical. So you can see that this is a vertical bank running into a hump. And so this is a high percentage spot. This is that actual spot on the water. and about a 6-pounder that we won a big fish of the tournament that was caught on the nail rig. You can see the Daiwa Steve's rod right there. You can see the buoys marking the hump and the channel swing. So a lot of folks were fishing on top of the hump because it was obvious with those buoys there, but right around where that channel swing is, it went from 5 feet on top of the hump to it was about 40 feet right there, and that fish was right in that break between 25 to 30 feet of water. This is what that spot looked like on the actual fish finder. This is a screenshot from my Lorenz HDS 12. Another good spot to fish the nail rig is off of points. So this is a point with a channel swing in it in Diamond Valley Lake that my team partner and I have won a bunch of tournaments off of using the nail rig. And essentially what we would do is set up on the shallow point or shallow side of the point and that cast out into deeper water. We call that fishing uphill. So we set up our boat on the shallower side of the point and cast the nail rig into deeper water, let it hit the bottom, and work it uphill. And I'm going to talk about how I work these baits. Let me go back real quick. So let's talk about how we fish the Neko rig. Since we talked about baits, you're going to use some kind of finesse worm with a nail rig in the head. And I see your hand, Kevin. I'm going to get to your question as soon as I'm done, but I'm going to get to as many questions as possible. There are really 3 ways that I fish the nail rig. Either I dead stick it, meaning I throw it out on slack line. It's very important that when you cast this bait on the spinning rod that you use slack line, meaning you don't have tension in the line, because a lot of the bites will come on the fall. What you see here is about just under a 10-pounder that I caught an FLW tournament off a Clear Lake on 8-pound test using a nail rig zoom trick worm. That fish bit on the fall because that bait with a nail in the head really glides through the water column. It looks like something dying. That fish picked up that bait, wrapped me around a piling, and went into deep water. Had to get the rod around the piling. I chased that fish into deeper water with 8-pound tests. Biggest fish of the tournament, part of a 25-pound limit, all caught on the nail rig. So when I talk about dead sticking, whether I'm off of a point, whether I'm throwing at a dock, whether I'm throwing at a brush pile, whether I'm throwing at a bluff, some of those spots we just show you, I'm just going to throw the bait out there on slack line and let the bait glide to the bottom and just wait. A lot of times you'll pick up your slack line and the fish has got it. And again, this bait, typically the fish swallow it. And so it's important to watch your line because you'll see your line jump. And so the dead stick is probably the #1 way that I fish this bait. Keeping it in a spot 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 10 seconds. But the main thing is if you're fishing in 25, 30 feet of water, you're going to throw that bait out there and let it go all the way to the bottom. The next thing I do is called the shake, meaning I threw it out there, I dead stick it, I didn't get a bite. Then I'm going to shake the bait all the way back to the boat. And I shake it very vigorously with my rod, using my rod tip. I shake it, I shake it, I shake it, I shake it, stop. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, stop. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, stop. And sometimes you'll be shaking it and you'll just feel thunk, and the fish will pick it up. And with that nail in it and that hook wacky style, when you're shaking it, it makes that worm stand straight up. If you fish it in the pool, you'll see it. The third technique that I use, if I'm not getting bit on the dead stick, I'm not getting bit on the shake, I'll drag the bait. Again, I'll throw it out towards some kind of object, let it go to the bottom. Instead of shaking it, I'll drag it, just a slow drag. And those are really the 3 ways that I fish the bait. It works year round. Usually a lot of bites come on the fall. Keep your rod tip high. You want to have slack line on the shake. You don't want to set on this. You want to do what we call reel set, meaning you feel the bite, you reel, and then you just pull up on your rod. You're using light line. If you set like if you're flipping, you'll break the line. Most of the fish eat the bait and just take off. This is a big fish technique, and it catches highly pressured bass, particularly in lakes where people aren't using this or the fish have never seen a nail rig. Another thing we do in terms of trying to find some of these spots, this is a shot of me in my boat. I run a Ranger using the Navionics app on my tablet and in my phone, hooked up to my Lowrance HDS 12 via the Wi-Fi. The reason why this is important is that typically we are updating the maps of these lakes, and the most updated version of the map is always going to push out via the app in the phone and the tablet first. And so I can run these mapping software and connect to my HDS 12 Wi-Fi so that I have access to the most current mapping of the lake that I'm fishing. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm running control of my HDS 12 with my iPad, and I'm looking at the most current version of the map on my iPhone. And so if you don't have the app for your phone or your tablet, it's very inexpensive, but it's a great way to do a couple of things. I can be studying the map of a lake instead of having to go get in my boat. And I can actually put waypoints and charts and check the weather using the Navionics app. Again, you can find out about upcoming webinars. You can check out our website to see about other webinars. I'm going to get into some of the questions. I see some people had their hands raised. Again, Joseph, I asked your question in terms of what time of year is it most effective. I would probably say spring and or fall. That fish you saw, almost 10 pounds, was caught in the fall. Ben, how does this technique compare to a shaky head? The difference between a Neko rig and a shaky head is that the shaky head doesn't glide through the water column because it's typically heavier. Usually the nail that you put in the head or the Voss weight is not as heavy as a shaky head, so the shaky head doesn't have that glide motion. And so typically the shaky head is going to stay on the bottom a lot more, and the nail rig is going to come up off the bottom when you're shaking it. What color of ray do you use? I typically stick, Brian, with brown, I stick with green, but my team partners on the line, T Lane, he typically uses high vis colors like yellow and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, I would recommend that, but I'm so in tune with this technique that for me, it doesn't matter whether I use a high vis braided line or I use a green braided line. I typically use green braided line. I don't know why I say gray. I typically use a green braided line. There are a lot of high vis braided lines, particularly Daiwa J braid on the market. Do I think it's better? I think that's subjective to what you're more comfortable with. Chris, any suggestions on Shasta with the rig? I know it's going to be a player when I go up there in a few weeks. Yes. Pick out your favorite plastic worm. I would highly recommend, if you're just starting off doing this, get yourself a bag of watermelon candy, Zoom finesse worm. Get yourself some shrink wrap from your hardware store, a 1/0 Gamakatsu drop shot hook, a nail weight, and go to any place that's a bluff. Throw up to the bluff, let the bait hit the water, go to the bottom, and just shake it. If the fish are aggressive, the shake is the best technique. If the fish are not aggressive, then the dead stick and or the drag is a better technique. And so if you're getting a lot of bites, then you know you really should be shaking it. Let me go to some of the other questions there. And again, this is about answering your questions. And I think, Chris, I answered your question. Hopefully that answers your question. This technique absolutely works at Lake Shasta. You ought to be able to catch a ton of spotted bass. Another tip, Chris, that I like on Lake Shasta are clay banks. If you can find a clay bank that has a long sloping point, set up your boat in shallow water, throw in the deeper water, and shake the rig back uphill. Because a lot of people throw at the bank and the fish get conditioned to that. What about a weedless hook? Does that impact the action? Yes, it does. and I have never used a weedless hook, and I don't recommend using a weedless hook, I can make the bait weedless by just keeping the point of the hook in the plastic and making a groove in the plastic so that when a fish bites it and the hook is in the plastic, it'll come out. We call that texposing a bait. I personally don't like any of the weedless hooks on the market, and a lot of the fish bite this bait on the fall, and I want that hook to stick them without me having to actually set the hook. Hopefully that answers your question, Gabe. Let's see, I got some other questions here. Any suggestions? I talked about that. Ryan, do I feel the need to ever put a drop of super glue on the bait after you insert the nail? I have never done that because the baits that I'm using are so inexpensive that if that nail no longer stays in the head of the bait, then I'll just get a new bait. But certainly using glue would save you a couple of extra cents. But like I said, I'm going to rig 30, 40, 100 of these baits at one time. And so if I get to a point that I either lose a bait or I've caught a couple of fish on the bait and the nail's coming out, I'll just grab another bait, Ryan. But definitely putting some super glue in it would work. Joseph, when targeting fish in 20 to 25 feet of water, what size weight should you use? I always use that same, let me go back to that slide real quick. I always use the same 3/32 weight, Joseph. What I will do though is if it's windy, then I always use the whole weight. If it's not windy, then I'm going to probably bite off a quarter of this weight. But I found just using the whole 3/32 weight allows the bait to glide at the pace. Now, some people will use a half weight or different sizes. I really don't experiment with it because I haven't had a need to, but typically I'm going to use the whole 3/32 lunker lure nail weight. I've experimented with tungsten, and from my standpoint, the tungsten is just too damn expensive. For $3.29, I can get 25 of these lunker lure weights, and if I get hung up or I lose a bait, I'm not sweating it. As much as those tungsten nail weights cost, you're going to go through a lot of money because you're going to get hung up and you're going to lose a bait. And T-Lane, I think I answered that question. I typically like the heavier weight. I don't like the lightweight because I just feel like the heavier weight allows my bait to glide like I want it to glide. I'm in Virginia with muddy water. This works muddy water, clear water. It just flat out works. If you're concerned about the muddy water, what you could do is use a chartreuse marker and mark the tail of the bait. But this will absolutely work, Jerry, in muddy water in Virginia. I fished this bait all over the country, and it flat out just catches fish. Now, where I probably wouldn't be doing this is somewhere where there's a lot of grass or tules, not because it doesn't work, because of the line size. When that fish bites, it's going to be advantage fish. What is the name of the screw-in weight in some of the pictures? It's a Voss screw-in weight, and you can get that at Tackle Warehouse. They also have a Facebook page. It's a local company in Southern California called Voss, V-O-S-S. But if you go to Tackle Warehouse, they have the Voss weight. When using, Brad, when using creature baits or worm or swim baits, what size? I always use the same size hook, a 1/0 Gamakatsu hook. And because we use shrink wrap or an O-ring, that hook is open. So when the fish bites, you should get them. But you do lose fish from it. I miss it. Do you shrink the shrink tube? I do not shrink the shrink tube. You can shrink the shrink tube, but the sizes that I buy kind of snug on the plastic worm anyways, so you shouldn't need to shrink it, but you can. Chris, do you have any special color you would recommend for Shasta? Yes, watermelon candy. Watermelon candy will work. Green pumpkin candy, green pumpkin. Those are the three main colors that I use in terms of Zoom baits or any other baits for that matter, Cincos. Those are the three colors that I use. Steve, what about fishing in current? This works in current. This technique works everywhere under any condition. The only time I typically do not use it is when I'm fishing deeper than 30 feet of water. And it's just because it's so light, it takes forever to get to the bottom, and it's hard to maintain bottom contact. So this bait works. It's a shallow water technique. What size shrink tube did you say for the Zoom trick worm? I don't know the size of the shrink tube. I apologize, Ben, but take you a Zoom trick worm to your hardware store and you'll be able to see. What I would recommend doing is that they have a shrink tube kit that has every different size of shrink tube. Start with that, and then it'll give you an idea of what size shrink tube best fits on the bait that you're using. What are my top 3 baits for this technique? Zoom trick worm, Zoom finesse worm, missile bait fuse 4.4. Those baits come in standard size. So the missile fuse is 4.4 inches. Zoom trick worm is about 6-7 inches. Zoom finesse bait is like 4.5 inches. And so those are standard sizes for those baits. So if you get a Zoom trick worm, it only comes in one size. I think they did just come out with a Zoom trick worm for shaky head, which is bigger. But a traditional Zoom trick worm is about 6-7 inch worm. A traditional Zoom finesse worm is about a 4.5 inch worm, and a missile based fuse is 4.4 inches. Hopefully that answers your question, Joseph. Any other questions? These have been some great questions. Again, this webinar is being recorded. It'll be available to watch again at navionics.com. Ryan, when would you use a trick worm versus a finesse worm? You know, that is a great question. Typically, I would say the finesse worm. The Zoom trick worm is going to work where you got bigger fish, a delta and or a clear lake. If I'm fishing a lake near my home, which are highly pressured lakes, I'm typically going to stay with a smaller bait. Mark, I have fished this rig in India. Yes. As a matter of fact, Mark, I nearly made the Bassmasters Classic on the Alabama River in Alabama using this technique. It absolutely will catch those spotted bass. You have 2 species of spotted bass in Alabama. I fished this technique all over the country. And so places like the Alabama River and that chain of lakes, fished it at Lake Lanier in Atlanta, Georgia. This will work absolutely, Mark, on any lake that has bass in it. Rick, have you used the Neko rig on bedding bass? Yes, not in a sight fishing way, but this technique works in the spring because the fish are shallow and they're either guarding. And so it works in a similar manner that a Senko would, but it has a different glide. Like the Senko glides and shimmies, the Neko rig just slides. So absolutely it will catch those fish, Rick. Jerry, why braided line and not just braid? Because I'm fishing for highly pressured finesse catching type fish. And so the braid is easily seen by the fish in the water and the fluorocarbon isn't. You could go all braid. I wouldn't recommend it. Joseph, have you fished this bait on any of the TVA lakes? Did you have success? Yes, as a matter of fact, I have. And if you go back to the Bassmasters that they had on Tennessee, the Tennessee River, Kentucky Lake rather, you'll actually see that Brett Height made the top 10 fishing the nail rig in a 7-inch cut tail Yamamoto worm. So it will absolutely work on the Tennessee River, Kentucky Lake, those lakes. On a lake like that, though, I wouldn't go any less than 10-pound test. That's a great place, a system, Joseph, to use 10-pound test. And a bigger worm like a Zoom trick worm or a Yamamoto 7-inch cut tail worm. Brad, when are you using creature-based swim bait? I mean, this technique Brad, doesn't have anything to do with swim baits. You would never use it for a swim bait. The creature baits you would use on lakes where they respond to crawdads a little better. So instead of flipping, you'd use a creature bait with a nail rig, baby brush hog, or a full brush hog. They both would work. When I'm sight fishing, I use Costa Del Mar sunglasses, the best sunglasses on the earth, in my opinion, Brian, but there's a lot of good sunglasses out there. Jerry, braided leader puts braid at the hook. Do you mean braided line with a fluorocarbon leader? Yes, Jerry, braided line with a fluorocarbon leader. We talked about connecting the two via uni line. You might have came in a little later, Jerry, but we went over that. Matter of fact, I think it should be on the slide that we're on. Should show you braid and fluoro next to it. Do I ever use a Cinco? Marcus, absolutely. I use a Cinco, and it was on a couple of slides. If you came in late, you saw a picture of a 6-inch Cinco and a slim Cinco as baits that you can use this technique with. The Neko rig will absolutely catch smallmouth, Joseph. It'll catch any bass swimming and have caught some mega smallmouth bass. Absolutely, Joseph. Do you use a longer leader of fluoro to get the knot well to the spool? I typically, the rule of thumb for me is I make my fluoro leader the length of the rod that I'm using. However, if I'm fishing around wood or docks, I'm going to use straight fluoro because the wind will catch your braid and it affects your ability to skip a bait. Yes, Yamamoto has a 7-inch cut-tail worm, Chris. What about using larger baits for less pressured fish? Yes, we talked about a Zoom trick worm. We talked about a 7-inch cut-tail worm. You absolutely can use a larger worm. If you could pick the conditions, time of year, etc., what would you prefer to fish this rig? I fish this rig under any conditions, and it typically is going to outfish any other bait 0 to 25. So if I was picking a time of year, it would either be spring or fall, and the fish are in 0 to 25 feet of water. I'm going to catch them on this bait. And yes, I use the same baits for smallmouth and largemouth. It's less about bait and more about technique. And so you could pretty much, if you're drop shotting or you're Texas rigging, you can take that same worm, or you're using a shaky head, you could take the same bait, apply this information that I went over today, and use a nail rig in the place of those baits, and you'll start to catch more fish because it's a different presentation. Yes, Marcus, I typically use a one-eye Gamakatsu drop shot bait in all of these baits we've talked about today, and that is in the slide. This webinar is being recorded. It'll be available in a couple weeks on navionics.com or our Navionics YouTube page. When will you pass on the nail rig in favor of a drop shot or a shaky head? I will use a shaky head in an environment where I keep getting hung up with the nail rig. And so if I'm fishing a rock pile that has a lot of big rocks and I'm getting hung up with the nail rig, then I will go to a shaky head. I will not use the nail rig in deeper than 25, 30 feet. So if I'm fishing in the winter on our deep lakes where we will catch fish out of 50 and 60 feet of water, I will go to a drop shot. Hopefully that answers your question, Jason. If you use a high quality line, Steve, like a Toray, Carbon Pro, Sunline, you should not have line twists. I don't get line twists. If you use a high quality spinning reel like a Daiwa Steez or a Daiwa Ballistic or whatever, Shimano, whatever company that you like, there's a lot of great reels on the market. If you use a high quality spinning reel and a high quality fluorocarbon line, you should not get line twists. If there aren't any other questions, again, I thank you all for coming out and listening to my presentation. We've gone a little over. We've gone a little over time. This webinar is being recorded. Appreciate you all being here. If you have any other questions, you can reach me at Navionics at Shabazz. Let me go there real quick. There's my email address, rshabazz@navionics.com. Again, I appreciate you all coming out, listening to my webinar. It is being recorded. It will be available at this web address. If I did not get to your question, please email me at rshabazz@navionics.com. Thank you all for listening. Have a good evening. Good luck out there. Catch a big one.